Welcome to Hangar 51 Files, where history's secrets, classified operations, and hidden truths come to light. From Cold War black ops to the future of warfare, from lost artifacts to emerging defense technologies, we investigate the stories buried beneath official narratives. No speculation, no clickbait, just hard-hitting research, expert analysis, and the pursuit of truth. You're now inside the briefing room. Stay sharp, stay curious. This is Hangar 51 Files.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers on a really fascinating and I think quite complex slice of geopolitical history.
Absolutely.
Think about a landscape where, the difference between open war and these hidden moves, it was just constantly blurry.
Yeah.
A place where what wasn't said, the covert stuff, actually spoke much, much louder than any official statement. We're stepping into a world really shaped by what strategists call deniable warfare.
That's exactly it. And our mission today for this deep dive, it's really a precision briefing. We're going to be laser focused on the geopolitical, the military, and the strategic Cold War dynamics.
Right.
The ones that fundamentally shaped Rhodesia's very turbulent transition into what we know as Zimbabwe today.
So just to be clear for everyone listening, this isn't a broad history lesson on the society or politics in the usual sense.
No, not at all. It's a sharp, factual look. Analytical, examining a very specific strategic environment. Our goal here is to give you, the listener, that crucial context.
The background you need.
Exactly. The background. You need to understand this really intricate world of deniable special forces operations. And specifically, one operation we'll be diving into in much, much more detail down the line.
And to do that, we've really dug into some pretty powerful sources, often declassified material, actually.
Yeah, historical documents, quite detailed military doctrine papers, analyses of these kinds of covert operations.
These aren't just, dry academic texts. They're the building blocks, the raw material, really, for putting together a comprehensive and hopefully neutral understanding of a critical period.
And often misunderstood.
Definitely misunderstood. Southern African history, particularly the Rhodesian Bush War and its immediate aftermath. It was a time when this relatively small, landlocked country became, almost a microcosm of the bigger global fight, the Cold War.
Fought out through proxies and shadows.
Precisely. So let's start unwrapping this. Where do we begin? The Bush War itself seems like the logical starting point.
It is. Let's set the stage with the Rhodesian Bush War. A conflict that really intensified, raged from about 1964 right up to 1979.
Okay.
Now, at its core, this was a multifaceted struggle, primarily between the Rhodesian government, which was the established power, and two main indigenous guerrilla forces.
Oh, right. I've heard the names ZAPU and ZNU.
That's them. On one side, you had the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, and on the other, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU.
Okay.
What's really critical to grasp here is that these weren't, marching in lockstep. They weren't a unified front under one banner.
Different groups, different goals, maybe?
Different groups, different leadership, and crucially, different ideological alignments. And those alignments were absolutely key to how the wider Cold War struggle played out in that specific region.
Okay, so this is where the Cold War overlay comes in. How did that work? Who backed whom?
Well, this is where it gets, as you said earlier, really interesting. Because these internal divisions, they almost perfectly mirrored the global ones. ZAMPU's military wing, they were known as ZIPRA, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army. They were very clearly aligned with the Soviet Union.
Okay. Moscow's influence.
Significant influence.
Yeah.
They received training, weapons, strategic advice, you name it, from Moscow and its allies, like Cuba, for instance.
Right, and ZANU knew.
ZANU's military wing, ZANLA, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, they found their main support coming from Beijing.
China. So a Sino-Soviet split playing out in Africa.
Absolutely. ZANLA embraced Maoist doctrines, guerrilla warfare theory, and got Chinese military support. Now, this external alignment, this backing from Moscow and Beijing, it fundamentally pulled Rhodesia into that wider global Cold War struggle.
Couldn't avoid it.
No way. You had the major powers, the USSR, China, and importantly, apartheid South Africa next door all getting involved, often covertly, providing significant support.
So South Africa was involved too. On which side?
South Africa primarily supported the Rhodesian government, seeing the nationalist movements, especially those backed by communist powers, as a direct threat to its own system and regional stability from their perspective.
Okay, so you have the Rhodesian government backed by South Africa, fighting ZAPU backed by the Soviets, and ZANU backed by the Chinese.
In essence, yes. It turned what might have been a localized independence struggle into a genuine Cold War proxy battlefield. It wasn't just about Rhodesia's future anymore.
It was bigger.
Much bigger. It was about containing communism for some, expanding influence for others, testing out military doctrines and equipment on a live, very brutal stage.
And you mentioned China's motivation wasn't purely ideological solidarity.
That's right. Some of our sources, like the Daily Maverick analysis, point out that China's help to Zanyu wasn't just about supporting revolution. It was also driven by Beijing's own strategic calculus.
How so?
Well, think about the timing. The 1960s saw the Sino-Soviet split really heat up. They were rivals, competing for influence globally.
Right, competing for leadership of the communist world.
Exactly. So for China, backing ZANL in southern Africa was partly a way to counter Soviet influence, to stop Moscow from gaining too strong a foothold in the region.
Ah, a strategic countermove against the Soviets.
Precisely. And it was also a chance for China to promote its own model of revolutionary warfare, the Maoist model, as distinct from and maybe even superior to the Soviet approach.
So these local fighters were caught up in superpower rivalries.
Deeply interwoven. It shows how conflicts that seem localized on the surface were often just arenas for these much larger global power games. African nations becoming essentially strategic chess pieces.
And these different backers, the Soviets and the Chinese, they influenced how Zaitiyu and Zanu actually fought, didn't they? Their tactics were different.
Starkly different. And it directly reflected their patrons' military doctrines. Take ZANL, backed by China.
Okay.
They fully adopted Mao Zedong's theories of guerrilla warfare. This put an incredible emphasis on mobilizing the peasantry, the rural population, the whole concept of people's war.
The fish swimming in the sea of the people idea.
That's exactly the one. And it wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was actively drilled into Zanyu cadres by Chinese military instructors. These instructors were from the People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
Where did this training happen?
In camps outside Rhodesia, like the famous Magaigo camp in Tanzania. And these ZANLA fighters, especially in the early 70s, they were often described as being almost more political commissars than traditional soldiers.
Really? Focused on politics first.
Very much so. Their specialized training was heavily focused on mass mobilization techniques, how to embed themselves within rural communities, how to understand and leverage local grievances.
Like what kind of grievances?
Things like land deprivation, which is a huge issue, or unpopular government policies like restrictions on cattle grazing. They use these very concrete local issues to gain popular support, to win people over to their sides.
So building a base from the ground up.
Exactly. They aim to win the population's loyalty, not just defeat the Rhodesian army in pitched battles.
Okay, so that was Zanilo's Maoist approach. How did ZIPRA, the Soviet-backed group, compare?
Well, ZIPRA certainly got material support and some level of cooperation from people in the areas where they operated. But by and large, they lacked that really deep, sophisticated political infrastructure in the villages that Zanilo spent years meticulously building.
Why was that? Just a different focus.
It seems to be a direct consequence of adhering more closely to Soviet guerrilla warfare theories. The Soviet model at the time tended to prioritize more conventional military aspects.
Like what?
Like preparing for more conventional engagements, sabotage, maybe focusing more on urban insurrection theory rather than Zanilo's deep emphasis on rural politicization and building that broad base of popular support.
So less hearts and minds, more military muscle.
You can simplify it that way, yes. The Soviet model, in that context, seemed more focused on eventually building a force that could confront the Rhodesian military more directly, rather than embedding politically first.
Did that have longer-term consequences?
It absolutely did. This difference in approach ultimately impacted ZAPU quite significantly when it came to the political transition and the elections later on.
How so?
Because they simply didn't have the same widespread, ground-level ideological foundation or political organization that ZANL had built. When the fighting stopped and it became a political contest for votes, ZANL had a huge head start in terms of popular reach and organization.
That makes sense. And geographically, did they operate in different parts of the country?
Yes, their areas of operation largely reflected these strategies too. ZAPU-ZIPRA's activities were mostly confined to specific regions. Think Matabeleland, parts of North Mashonaland West, the Northern Midlands.
Areas where they had maybe more historical or ethnic ties?
That played a part, yes. But their overall geographical reach was more limited compared to ZANLA.
And Zanila.
ZANLA, because of that sustained grassroots politicization and military activity, managed to establish a presence, sometimes even effective control, over most of the rest of the country. They embedded themselves in the daily life of large swaths of the rural population.
So by the end of the war, say around 1979, 1980, who was seen as having carried the fight more?
Well, by 1980, as the conflict was winding down and the political transition was beginning, the general consensus, certainly among observers and within the nationalist movement itself, was that Zanila had shouldered the majority of the actual fighting burden.
And critically,
They had built the most extensive network of popular support across the country. That was hugely significant for what came next.
okay, so that's the guerrilla side. What about the Rhodesian government? How did they respond to this growing insurgency?
The Rhodesian government mounted a very robust counterinsurgency campaign. And in purely tactical terms, military observers at the time and even since have noted it was highly effective in certain aspects.
They had some successes.
Definitely. This period saw the rise, the real forging of elite Rhodesian counterinsurgency units. Names that became, well, almost legendary in the world of asymmetric warfare.
Like who?
The Sela Scouts, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, the RLI, and the Rhodesian Special Air Service, the SAS.
Okay, these were specialized units.
Highly specialized, trained, equipped, and deployed specifically to combat the guerrilla threat using unconventional tactics. They weren't just a conventional army.
And the Sela Scouts, they were known for something quite specific, weren't they? Pseudo-operations.
That's right. Pseudo-operations became a hallmark tactic, particularly for the Sela Scouts. It was a really remarkable and definitely controversial strategy.
How did it work?
Essentially, it involved government-controlled paramilitary units, often composed of former insurgents who had been captured or turned, actively imitating the guerrilla groups.
So Rhodesian soldiers pretending to be Zenla or Zipra.
Exactly. They would dress like them, carry the same weapons, operate in the bush just like them. They'd infiltrate guerrilla territory and networks.
And what would they do?
They might commit acts designed to discredit the insurgents, damaging infrastructure, burning crops, sometimes even committing acts of violence against civilians, all while disguised as guerrillas.
Wow. Why? What was the goal?
It was twofold, really. First, sow confusion and distrust. Turn the local population against the insurgents by making them believe the guerrillas were responsible for these brutal acts. Undermine their support base.
Okay, psychological warfare.
Absolutely. And second, these pseudo-teams could use their cover to gain credibility and infiltrate actual insurgent networks.
It could gather intelligence.
Precisely. To gather human intelligence, UMNN, identify leaders, locate bases, understand plans.
And then
that intelligence would feed directly back to the Rhodesian security forces, informing more conventional military operations. Pinpoint airstrikes, raids on guerrilla camps, targeted assassinations.
that's quite something. Denial and deception.
A textbook example. Misleading the enemy, misleading the population, obscuring who is actually doing what. It's about making it impossible to be sure who the enemy really is.
How does that fit into broader military thinking about counterinsurgency, or Kuain?
Well, if you look at standard Kuwayan principles, like those outlined in many military field manuals, these pseudo-ops, while controversial, actually align with some core tenets.
Such as?
Such as the absolute importance of securing the support of the population, understanding that the civilian population is the center of gravity in an insurgency.
Right, the hearts and minds thing again.
Exactly. Kuwayan doctrine emphasizes that civil considerations, the attitudes, beliefs, needs, and loyalties of the people, are normally the most important factor. Winning the military fight isn't enough if you lose the people.
And things like unity of effort.
Unity of effort across government agencies, yes. And critically, the need to learn and adapt faster than the insurgents. Pseudo-ops were certainly an adaptation, a way to get inside the enemy's decision cycle.
So influencing the population is paramount.
Absolutely. Which leads to another key Kuwayan concept, information engagement.
Propaganda, essentially.
It encompasses propaganda, but it's broader. Insurgent groups, as we know, rely heavily on propaganda, clandestine radio, pamphlets, nowadays the internet, social media to challenge the government's legitimacy, spread their narrative, recruit. So counterinsurgents have to fight back in that information space, using factual information where possible, but also psychological operations, PSYOPS, to influence attitudes and perceptions. And critically, persuading people through the actions of the security forces on the ground.
Actions speak louder than words?
Sometimes. But there's a chilling line in some Kuwayan doctrine that says, basically, perception is often more important than truth.
Wow. That really underlines the psychological dimension.
It does. It's a battle for the narrative, for legitimacy in the eyes of the people, just as much as it's a battle for physical control of territory.
And thinking about the environment, Rhodesia was mostly rural then, right? Bush warfare. But you mentioned doctrine was already looking ahead.
Yes, even back then, military strategists were noting global trends towards urbanization. There was a growing realization that future insurgencies were likely to be fought less in jungles and mountains and more in sprawling urban areas.
Which presents totally different challenges.
Completely different. Denser populations, easier cover for insurgents, harder to distinguish combatants from civilians, immense potential for collateral damage. It complicates everything.
And what about external support for insurgencies? You mentioned the Soviets and Chinese, but is it always state actors?
Not necessarily. External support is crucial for most insurgencies to survive and thrive, but it can come in many forms. Moral support, political backing, resources, weapons, money, training, or providing sanctuary, a safe place to operate from.
Like neighboring countries.
Neighboring countries are common providers of sanctuary, yes. But support can also come from further afield. Countries seeking political or economic influence in a region might back an insurgency. Even transnational groups, non-state actors, can play a role. This external support is often the oxygen an insurgency needs.
And the actual tactics on the ground during the Bush War, what did they typically involve?
You saw a lot of classic guerrilla tactics. Ambushes were very common, quick, surprise attacks on security force patrols or convoys designed to inflict casualties and disappear.
Hit and run.
Exactly. On the counterinsurgency side, you had operations like cordon and search, where security forces would seal off an area, a village or a district, and then systematically search it for insurgents, weapons caches, or sympathizers.
Trying to root them out.
Yes. And the guerrillas relied heavily on networks of safe houses, places to hide and rest, often provided by sympathizers, and of course, guerrilla base camps.
Where were those usually located?
Often in remote, inaccessible terrain mountains, dense bush, where they were hard for security forces to reach. But sometimes they could even be established in urban areas if there was enough popular support to hide them.
And the overall goal of these guerrilla operations?
Generally, guerrilla operations are offensive in nature, even if they seem small-scale. They're about harassment, causing confusion, destroying infrastructure, attriting security forces bit by bit, and crucially, lowering the morale of the government and its supporters while boosting their own side's morale.
A war of attrition, psychologically as well as physically.
Very much so. It's about wearing down the enemy's will to fight, proving the government can't protect its people, and building momentum towards an eventual victory, whether military or political.
Which brings us to the end of the war, and that transition period in 1980. How did that come about?
Well, this incredibly complex and brutal conflict eventually led to a negotiated settlement. The key diplomatic process was the Lancaster House Agreement.
That was held in London, right?
In London, yes. A series of really intense negotiations running from September 10th to December 15th, 1979. It was the process that paved the way for Rhodesia to become the independent nation of Zimbabwe.
Under what terms?
Crucially, the agreement stipulated that internationally supervised elections should be held. This supervision was under British authority, allowing Rhodesia to transition to legal independence under a new constitution agreed upon by all parties.
Who were the main players around that table? It must have been tense.
Immensely tense. You have to picture the scene. Decades of conflict, deep animosity. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, chaired the conference, a huge diplomatic undertaking.
And from the Rhodesian side?
You had Bishop Abel Muzorewa, who was leading the transitional internal government at the time, and Ian Smith, the former prime minister, representing the outgoing Rhodesian Front government.
And the nationalist forces.
They were represented by the Patriotic Front delegation. Now, the Patriotic Front was technically an alliance of ZANU and ZAPU for the purpose of negotiations.
So, Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo.
Yes, representing ZANU and ZAPU respectively. These were leaders of groups whose forces had been actively fighting each other, as well as the Rhodesian state, just months before, now sitting together negotiating the future.
Incredible pressure, and major outcome was the military situation, the armies.
Yes, a central and perhaps the most challenging element of the Lancaster House Agreement was the plan for military integration. It mandated the creation of a new Zimbabwe National Army, the ZNA.
Okay, and who was going into this new army?
This is where it gets incredibly volatile. The ZNA was to be formed by integrating elements from 3 previously hostile forces.
3?
Yes. Elements of the existing Rhodesian security forces, the very army that had been fighting the insurgency. Then you had ZIPRA, ZAPU's Soviet-backed army, and ZANLA, ZANU's Chinese-backed army.
You're kidding. Soldiers who were literally trying to kill each other weeks before were now supposed to form a single army.
That was the plan. Imagine the reality on the ground. Being told to wear the same uniform, salute the same flag, take orders from commanders you viewed as the enemy just yesterday. The level of immediate, deep-seated mistrust was just profound.
I can barely imagine how that could work.
It was a monumental challenge, and arguably the most precarious part of the whole transition. Yet somehow the elections went ahead.
And Robert Mugabe won.
Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF party won a decisive victory in the 1980 elections. This marked the definitive end of white minority rule and the assumption of power by ZANU-PF.
Why ZANU-PF, do you think? Was it just that ZANLA had done more fighting?
That was a big part of it. ZANL's extensive political work, that mass mobilization we talked about, and their pervasive military activity across most of the country meant they had significant de facto control on the ground before the election even started.
They had the infrastructure.
They had the infrastructure, they had established rudimentary administrative structures in many rural areas, they had won hearts and minds, or at least compliance, and Mugabe himself.
Yes.
His consistently militant stance throughout the liberation struggle had really endeared him to the guerrilla fighters, the rank and file. He was seen as uncompromising. This allowed him to start the election campaign with a huge advantage. Much of the country was already, in effect, under his movement's control.
So the election confirms ZANU's dominance, but now they have this nightmare integration task for the army.
Precisely. And that military integration process itself immediately became a major point of vulnerability, a clear powder keg, really, a precursor to future instability.
How did that mistrust play out in practice?
It wasn't just theoretical suspicion. It manifested very practically. Fractured command structures were common. Former enemies often refusing orders from officers from the other side.
Open insubordination.
Reports of insubordination, yes. Raw factional rivalries constantly simmered just below the surface, sometimes boiling over into actual violence.
Clashes between the integrated units.
There were reports, especially in the early days, of hidden caches of weapons being maintained by former guerrilla units, not trusting the process. And yes, even outright skirmishes breaking out within assembly points or integrated battalions.
It sounds less like integration and more like just containing hostility within the same barracks.
For a time, that's probably accurate. It wasn't just distrust. It was a tactical minefield, layered with years of ingrained hatred and suspicion. Forcing these sworn enemies together created an incredibly precarious peace.
Built on very shaky ground.
Extremely fragile foundations, vulnerable to any internal spark or significantly external pressure.
Which brings us to the neighbors, particularly South Africa. How did they react to this new Zimbabwe, led by Mugabe?
This leads directly into the post-war power struggles. Zimbabwe, despite its hard-won independence, didn't get a peaceful honeymoon. It almost immediately became a Cold War flashpoint in southern Africa.
And South Africa's view?
From Pretoria's perspective, the emergence of an independent Zimbabwe, led by a former Marxist guerrilla movement like ZANU-PF, was seen as a significant regional threat.
Why specifically?
Well, South Africa at the time was pursuing its own complex geopolitical path. Officially non-aligned in the main East-West Cold War, but fiercely anti-communist in its regional outlook. They engaged pragmatically with various powers globally, even maintaining some level of contact with Russia, China, Iran, depending on their interests.
So a pragmatic foreign policy, but a hardline regionally.
Exactly. Any shift in the regional balance, especially a large, strategically located neighbor like Zimbabwe, potentially aligning with Soviet or Chinese influence, was seen as a direct threat to South Africa's own security, its economic dominance, and the stability of its apartheid system.
So what did Pretoria do about it?
To counter this perceived threat and to maintain its regional dominance, Pretoria adopted a pretty deliberate and aggressive policy. A doctrine, really, of regional destabilization.
Destabilization. What did that involve?
It involved a sophisticated mix of tools, covert influence, economic pressure, political manipulation, and, crucially, what are often called black ops.
Secret military or intelligence operations.
Yes, it's a form of asymmetric warfare, where a state uses unorthodox, often deniable, tactics against a neighbor it wants to weaken or control.
What kind of tactic?
Things like sabotage of key infrastructure railways, fuel depots, supporting dissident groups within the target country, spreading disinformation, carrying out assassinations, deep intelligence penetration, all designed to undermine the target regime from within, keep it off balance, prevent it from consolidating power or becoming a platform for opposition to South Africa.
And all done secretly.
The key was deniability. making sure these actions couldn't be definitively traced back to Pretoria. It's warfare fought in the shadows.
So, in the early years of Zimbabwe's independence, say 1980 to 83,
That period saw Zimbabwe become an intense arena for these kinds of clandestine actions. The gloves came off, covertly speaking.
deniable operations became common, like the pseudo-ox used during the Bush War, but maybe state-sponsored now.
Exactly. Techniques like false flags and potentially even pseudo-operations continued or were adapted. A false flag operation, as our sources define it, is specifically designed to mislead.
How?
By manipulating evidence or having one group carry out an attack but making it look like someone else did it, like those historical examples.
You mentioned Operation Grief.
Right. Otto Skorzeny's operation in World War II, where German commandos wore U.S. uniforms to cause chaos behind Allied lines during the Battle of the Bulge.
And the Soviet example.
The shelling of Manila. The Soviets shelled a Russian village near the Finnish border in 1939, blamed it on Finland, and used it as a pretext to launch the Winter War.
So, fabricating an incident to justify action or just to destabilize?
Precisely. These aren't just historical curiosities. They illustrate the core principle. Create a false narrative. Blame your enemy. Achieve your objective without leaving your own fingerprints. Plausible deniability is the name of the game.
Making it impossible for the target to officially point the finger and retaliate.
Exactly. It paralyzes their response, sows internal confusion and suspicion. It's a potent tool of statecraft, especially during heightened tensions like the Cold War.
And this ties back to intelligence gathering, understanding the enemy's weaknesses.
Absolutely. Effective covert action relies on good intelligence. You need to know the vulnerabilities, the internal fault lines, who might be turned, where the weaknesses are. It's a constant cycle of intelligence gathering, covert action, assessing the results, and gathering more intelligence.
A hidden war alongside the more visible political struggles.
A hidden parallel war. Which brings us to a very specific, very dramatic event that really crystallizes all these dynamics.
Which event is that?
The Incomo Barracks sabotage. August 1981.
Incomo Barracks, what was that?
It was a major arms depot for the new Zimbabwe National Army, located not far from Harare. In August 81, there was a massive explosion there. Catastrophic.
How bad?
Huge. It's estimated that something like $50 million worth of military equipment was destroyed. This is $1981, mind you. A staggering loss for the ZNA, which was still trying to find its feet.
Just devastating for their military capability.
Devastating. Not just the loss of weapons and ammunition, but the psychological blow. It massively undermined confidence in the ZNA's ability to secure its own key facilities. It screamed vulnerability.
And who was blamed?
Well, almost immediately, suspicion pointed toward external involvement, specifically South Africa. And an individual was arrested in connection with it.
Who?
A Captain Patrick Garrick. He was an engineer in the ZNA, but critically, he was an ex-Rhodesian army officer who had been integrated into the new force.
An insider.
An insider with technical knowledge. While Pretoria, predictably, denied any involvement whatsoever, the suspicion of South African orchestration was very strong, almost immediate, both within Zimbabwe and among international observers.
What fueled that suspicion, besides Garrick's background?
The sheer scale and technical sophistication of the sabotage suggested planning and resources beyond disgruntled individuals. And it fit perfectly with South Africa's known strategy of destabilization. Plus, the incident became instantly shrouded in whispers and rumors.
About what?
Whispers of covert extraction, how Garrick might have been helped, and deeper intelligence penetration. It raised incredibly serious questions about internal compromise within the ZNA.
How deep did the rot go? Who else might have been involved? Could they trust anyone with a Rhodesian background?
Exactly. It fueled paranoia, deepened the existing mistrust between the former warring factions within the ZNA, and played right into the hands of anyone wanting to keep Zimbabwe weak and divided.
So Incomo becomes a classic example of this deniable warfare.
A chillingly classic example. An action designed to inflict massive damage, undermine the regime, sow discord, all without leaving definitive proof of who was behind it.
It really speaks to that idea you mentioned earlier, Cold War strategy unfolding in Africa through silence, not speeches.
Perfectly put. It wasn't about grand declarations or direct invasions. It was about sabotage, proxies, economic levers, covert operations, a war fought with whispers, explosions in the night, and plausible deniability, designed to keep the region unstable, off balance, without triggering a full-scale conventional war.
So, looking back at all this, the Bush War, the integration problems, the destabilization, Incomo, why does it matter for us today? What's the takeaway?
Well, the Incomo Barracks incident and that whole turbulent post-independence period in Zimbabwe serves as a really crucial case study. It's a window into how deniable warfare and covert statecraft actually worked during the Cold War, particularly in the African context.
What lessons can we draw?
It teaches us a profound lesson, I think, about how superpower strategies often played out not through direct confrontation, but indirectly. Through these clandestine actions, through supporting proxy forces, through meticulously maintaining that veil of deniability.
It shows how fragile peace agreements can be.
Especially when they involve integrating former enemies, and especially when powerful neighbors have a vested interest in seeing you fail. The foundations were inherently unstable.
And all this context, this is leading somewhere specific for us.
It is. This entire geopolitical picture, the deep mistrust inside the ZNA, the legacy of the Bush war tactics, the constant pervasive shadow of South African destabilization efforts. This is the direct, essential precursor.
To what?
To understanding the specific incident known as the Garrick extraction operation. The story of Captain Patrick Garrick doesn't end with his arrest for the Incomo bombing.
So this history is the necessary setup for that story.
Absolutely substantial background. You can't understand the significance, the complexity, or the implications of the Garrick extraction without understanding this intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and the covert war being waged in Southern Africa at that exact moment.
It really feels like these hidden conflicts, these silent wars, their echoes are still felt today, don't they?
Without a doubt. They continue to shape regional dynamics, political mistrust, and even global security challenges. It demands we try to understand these hidden forces, the ones that truly move nations beneath the surface of official narratives.
So, as we wrap up this prelude, the scene-setting deep dive, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What questions does this complex, often violent history spark for you, the listener, about the other hidden histories, the other silent operations still waiting to be fully uncovered?
Because it's only by digging into these intricate, often shadowy layers of the past that we can really start to get a handle on the strategic realities and the enduring challenges of our present world.
That's it for this episode of Hangar 51 Files, where we uncover the hidden, investigate the unexplained, and challenge the official story. If you found this episode insightful, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with those who refuse to accept surface-level narratives. For more deep dives, exclusive research, and behind-the-scenes content, visit www.hangar51files.com, our YouTube channel, at Hangar51Files, or our Substack, hangar51files.substack.com. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep questioning everything. This is Hangar 51 Files, signing off. No speculation, no clickbait, just hard-hitting research, expert analysis, and the pursuit of truth.